I'm going to start with a confession. It's never good, right? I have an eye disease, and I started a new medication this week, and it did not respond well to my eyes. And so I'm telling you that because you're going to see me blinking a whole lot. You're going to see me patting my eyes like I'm some kind of bishop or something like that. I'm not a bishop. I'm barely a person most days. But I just don't want that to be a distraction to you, okay? There's nothing I can do about it. I had an allergic reaction to an eye medication, and it's working itself out. But they're still not great. And so if you see that happening, just humor me and don't say anything. You know, just think, oh my gosh, poor Tommy. You know, play the sympathy violin, something like that. I'm not going to sit in this chair either. Sorry. So listen, we're going to keep going in John's Gospel. And we're going to talk through pieces of 18 and 19, those two chapters this morning, okay? And since those chapters deal with the arrest and the crucifixion of Jesus, topics that we spent quite a bit of time talking about over Good Friday and Easter services, I want to take a slightly different approach today to what I want to share with you. And but I want to say this, like, if you've never read these chapters all the way through, please, like, find the time to do that. You know, I want to encourage you to read them all the way through. But for our purposes this morning, we're going to start in chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 28, okay? It's going to be on the screen behind you. I'm going to be reading, and the screen's going to have it in the ESV translation, but, like, you should be able to follow along with it. If you're reading NIV or something similar, you should be able to follow along pretty easily. But here's what it says. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside and said to them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him for yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews, and he told them, "I find no guilt in him." So over these last few weeks, we've looked at these private conversations that Jesus had been having with his disciples between the chapters 13 and 17 of John. And what you've heard mentioned, it's commonly referred to as the upper room discourse. You know, and as we continue in our journey through this Gospel of John, we come to these last few chapters, deals with the trial, you know, the arrest, the crucifixion, and later the resurrection of Jesus. And we're introduced to someone here in chapter 18 who plays a pivotal role. In fact, he plays the pivotal role with regard to the sentencing and crucifixion of Jesus. And that individual is, of course, Pontius Pilate. Now, he's only referred to Pilate here in John's Gospel, but he's referred to Pontius Pilate a few other places in the New Testament. That's his full name, Pontius Pilate, you know, P squared. That's what his buddies used to call him. Sorry. Lots of bad dad jokes. I warned you they were coming. I was told that's why people didn't show up today. I don't know if that's true or not. He's mentioned not only in the Bible, but Pilate is also mentioned by a few of the ancient historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Eusebius. Why don't they have normal names? Have you ever thought about that? Why don't they have like Bob? Like ancient historians always have these ridiculous names. Anyway. To name a few, those are the guys that mentioned him. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that Pilate's mentioned in the Bible and by some historians outside of the Bible, for centuries, skeptics really questioned whether or not Pilate even ever existed. And they thought, the stories about Pilate in the Bible were fables, as many of them believed the stories about Jesus to be fables. And again, these are these skeptics. And the reason why skeptics thought that Pilate didn't exist and that these stories were fables was because for centuries, there was no archaeological evidence to point to Pilate's existence until 1961. In 1961, in Caesarea in Israel, there was a stone that was discovered. That is, it's known as the Pilate stele or the Pilate stone. There's a picture of it here. I'll show it to you. It's the first external evidence for Pontius Pilate. It's a 2 by 3 foot plaque, and it's carved in stone from the first century. The inscription etched in the stone is in Latin, and you can only read partial words of it, but this is what they were able to gather from those partial words that were etched in the stone. In English, it translates to "of Tiberius," because Tiberius was the emperor at the time. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Okay, that's what the stone says. First evidence to his existence, despite the fact that the Bible had been talking about it for centuries. Finally, archaeology caught up again with the Bible, to prove more of it to be true. We still know very little about this guy, but what we do know is that he became the prefect or the governor of Judea, which is in the middle province of Israel, and it included in it the city of Jerusalem, and that was a big deal. Appointed in the year AD 26, Pilate had this reputation for being a bloodthirsty and cruel man, especially against the Jews whom he oversaw as part of his reign appointed by Governor Tiberius, the Roman government. In fact, Jesus even references how cruel and bloodthirsty Pilate was in a story that's mentioned in Luke chapter 13. You don't have to turn there, but Luke writes there was a group of Jews from Galilee who were worshiping at the Temple Mount, and Pilate slaughtered them. Now, Jesus just makes a passing reference to that, but because Pilate historically and biblically had such a reputation for being bloodthirsty and cruel, historically we know that already at this point that we're joining into the story, he had been put on notice by Rome. Caesar had warned Pilate, stop being so cruel. You're indiscriminate in the way that you slaughter people. And so Pilate was put on notice, basically. Like, if you continue to do this, you're going to be recalled to Rome and you're going to lose your command. You're going to lose your power. So I share all of that with you as this backdrop to this story, because by the time that we get here in those pieces that we just read to this occasion where Jesus is brought before Pilate, Pilate is serving now as a judge, and he's about ready to make a determination as to whether or not Jesus had violated Roman law. Now, that's the law in which he governs. He was Rome in control. He governs Roman law. The Jews had their own separate law, and under Jewish law, they accused Jesus of blasphemy because Jesus claimed to be God. And they didn't believe that he was, so the Jews wanted him killed for blasphemy. The problem was that about 2 or 3 years before this scene is happening, the Roman government had stripped the Jews of the right to practice capital punishment according to Jewish law. So the Jews could not kill Jesus. And the method by which they would have killed Jesus would have been stoning to death. They couldn't enforce capital punishment against Jesus, even though they accused him of blasphemy, which is enough for their law to warrant a stoning to death, but breaking the Jewish law because the Roman government had stripped them of their right to enforce capital punishment. So what they had to do was they had to trump up a charge, as they were going to appeal this to Pilate. And the charge that they trumped up was sedition. Like he wants to overthrow the king. Jesus is claiming to be king, and so there's only one king, and that king is Caesar. And so that's the charge that they trumped up. Now, interestingly, Jesus knew the type of death that he would die. Because earlier in John's gospel, he said, if I be lifted up from the earth, all men will be drawn unto me. He was prophetically speaking, about his imminent death, where he was going to be lifted up on a cross. And so even Jesus knew in advance the type of death that he was going to die, and that it was going to be under Roman law, not Jewish law, despite the fact that both the charges were not valid. So the Jews come to Pilate, and they say, you got to crucify this guy because we can't kill him. And Pilate's like, what's the charge? And against this backdrop, listen, Pilate has all these competing voices in his head. He's got Caesar in this ear saying, stop slaughtering people. He's got this other voice in the other ear. It's this mob. It's this crowd of people that are shouting, crucify Jesus, crucify Jesus. And if Pilate had a third ear, he would have his wife's voice in the third ear. John doesn't record this, but Matthew does. And this is the kind of the beauty of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Because God inspired four different writers to talk about and to record the exact same story from four different angles. And so much of it overlaps, but there's a lot of unique information to each of the different gospel writers. And one of the things that's unique to Matthew was he mentions that Pilate's wife, and she's not named here, so we're just going to call her Mrs. Pilate. Mrs. Pilate has a dream, and the dream is about how innocent Jesus is. I'm just going to read it to you. It's in Matthew 27, verse 19. And to frame it up, Pilate is sitting on the judgment seat about to pronounce sentence on Jesus, okay? And Matthew says in 27, verse 19, besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. So apparently, God gives Mrs. Pilate a dream about Jesus, that he's innocent, that he's righteous. And so she's tormented by this dream. And so she goes to her husband and she says, hey, don't kill this guy. I've been tormented by a dream. He's a just man. He's an innocent man. And does Pilate take his wife's advice? No, right? Ladies, that hasn't changed in over 2,000 years. Sorry to tell you. Anyway, he doesn't take his wife's advice. I want to explain something that's happening here because it's important to the story. There's a providential aspect to this story, and there's a practical aspect to this story. What do I mean? Let me first start with the providential aspect of this story. A providential plan is God's caring provision for his people as he guides them along their journey of faith, accomplishing his purpose in them and through them. Okay, a providential act. Please know that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was God's providential plan to save the world. Peter, when he gets up on the day of Pentecost to preach, it's talked about in Acts chapter 2. Luke records it. In verse 23 of Acts chapter 2, Peter says this in the course of proclaiming the gospel and proclaiming the good news. He says, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So that's what Peter says there in Acts 2, that this was all the providential, predetermined plan of God for the salvation of the world. Peter wasn't the only one who said such a thing. Isaiah, 700 years before Christ, prophesied about the coming Messiah. In chapter 53, among other things, he says this in verse 5, that he was wounded for our transgressions, that he was bruised for our iniquities. This is all prophecy about Jesus. In verse 7, he says that he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. All of this was fulfilled in Christ, okay? In verse 8, that he would be stricken for the transgression of the people. And then down to verse 10 in Isaiah 53, yet it was the will of God, the will of the Lord to crush him. That was God's will. This was God's predetermined plan for the salvation of the world, that Jesus should die on the cross. So make no mistake about it. When we're looking at this story here, the crucifixion of Jesus was God's providential plan and God's providential timing to save the world through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross, so that whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Romans 10:13. And remember that Jesus knew this too. Remember, he would always say, my time has not yet come. But then he made it clear his time had come. He knew. This did not sneak up on him. This was a divine purpose at work. And now listen, because this is where it gets kind of tricky. Okay, but understand, a divine purpose at work, and God used a man to advance his purposes. No doubt unwillingly, or unknowingly, I should say, to the man, but a man who was predisposed to such a heinous decision because of a weakness in that man's soul. Now, what was the weakness in that man's soul? And here's where I think the providential aspect of this story intersects with the practical aspect of this story. Pilate had a weakness, and it was a weakness that God capitalized on to accomplish his divine purposes without violating Pilate's free will. But here's what his weakness was. Pilate had a weakness for what other people thought. And that weakness moved Pilate off center from what he knew was right. And this is not only where it gets very practical, but it could get pretty personal here. Let me show you what I mean by that statement about Pilate. In the opening verses that I read to you, we read together there in chapter 18, Pilate, he's interviewing Jesus, he's investigating the charges that have been brought against him, and he concludes, he rules that there is no reason to condemn him to death. Look again at verse 38 in chapter 18. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And after he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and he told them, I find no guilt in him. Now that's the first ruling. I find no fault in him at all. Now John doesn't tell this, but again, this is the beauty of how the Gospels overlap. Luke tells us at this point, when Pilate first stands up and says, I find no fault in him at all, Luke tells us that Pilate, then on this legal technicality, he says, you know what? Technically speaking, Jesus isn't even in my province because he's a Galilean. He's from the northern part of Israel, and the northern part of Israel was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. And so Pilate, Luke tells us at this point in the story, Pilate says, send Jesus to Herod Antipas. That's his problem now, not mine. So Jesus is sent up to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas interviews him a little bit. He jokes around with him some. He taunts Jesus, like, hey, Jesus, show me a miracle. Jesus doesn't show him any miracles, and so he's like, I'm done with you. And he sends him back to Pilate. and just for a side note, all this is happening in the wee early hours of the morning. Court doesn't normally happen at times like that, right? Wee early morning hours. But he sends him back to Pilate, and Pilate's like, great. I thought I had dodged a bullet. I thought Herod Antipas could take one for the team, this time. But instead, he sends him back to me. So there's this game of hot potatoes with Jesus and the responsibility of him. So here, Jesus is back, and Pilate's like, now what am I going to do? He's got Caesar in one ear. He's got the mob in his other ear. He's got his wife in his third ear, and he's thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? Here's what I'm going to do. Maybe I'm going to appease the crowd, and I'll make Caesar happy, and I'll make my wife happy. Happy wife, happy life, right? I got to live with her. This is all very real in the moment. He's like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have Jesus scourged. I will have him whipped, and Isaiah tells us, beyond recognition. So I'm going to have him whipped so severely, within an inch of his life. And maybe that will appease the mob. It'll get, Caesar off my back. All these things. It'll make my wife happy. But let's pick up in John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." So not once, not twice, but 3 times, Pilate finds no basis for condemning Jesus to death. So then the question is, why did he have him crucified? If 3 times he says there's no basis to condemn him, then why in the world did he end up having Jesus crucified? Well, the answer is because he listened to the loudest voices. And he gave in to the crowd. He appeased the mob. This is what happened. You see, he feared man certainly more than he feared God. And he wanted to please people. It even says further down in 19, in verse 12, it says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When you talk about the pressure that's being put on him, you know, he looked for every which way to be able to release Jesus. This is the last thing he wanted to do, you know, but fear of man. I'm afraid of Caesar, you know, and I want to please these people. You know, I want to keep all this that I've made for myself. You know, I don't want these people to not like me. I don't want Caesar to come down on me. You know, I don't want to lose all this that I've got. I don't want my wife to make me sleep on the couch. You know, all these things. This is the quandary that he's in. This is the torment that's going on in his head. And let's pick up in verse 13 of chapter 19. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and he sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, 6 a.m., okay? This is 6 a.m. Again, this is not the normal time for things like these proceedings to be taking place. All of this is happening in the early hours of the morning. He says to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Now think about that for just a minute. Maybe you remember a little bit of your American history. When the Revolutionary War started in Lexington, and the British came and they said to the colonists who had formed this Minuteman militia, by the way, they were all a part of the Church of Lexington, okay? The men formed this brigade that came into Lexington to fight the British. And the British said to them, "Throw down your arms in the name of the King of England." And they said, "We have no sovereign but God, and no king but Jesus." That's how the Revolutionary War started. Because our highest authority is God, not the King of England. Our highest authority is not the president, it's not Congress. Our highest authority is God. And these people that we just heard about, they're the chief priests, the leaders. And they're saying, no, Caesar is our highest authority. He's our king. They're literally thumbing their nose at God. And so in verse 16 of this chapter 19 of John, tragically, this is what happens. So he, being Pilate, delivered him over to them to be crucified. Pilate was controlled by the fear of man and the desire to please people. It was more important to him what people thought than it was for him to do the right thing. And this is painfully practical, friends, because this is something that all of us must wrestle with from time to time. Why? Because there's a little bit in every single one of us that wants to be liked. Pilate was captive to the fear of man and to this trap of pleasing people. Now, when I say that, don't misunderstand, okay? I hope that we want to please people in the sense of like, I care about what other people are going through. I care about serving people. I care about loving people in the way that God wants me to love them. You know, there is an honorable way to please people. But the thing I'm talking about, and I hope you all understand, it's when we become people pleasers where we are so bound to make sure that everybody is happy and that everybody likes us and that everybody's good with everything that we're doing. You know, like I got to fix everything. I got to make sure that everybody's happy. I got to make sure that they're happy, because if they're not happy, then they won't like me, and I want to be liked. And so to make sure that I'm liked, I'm going to make sure that everybody's happy with me. It's that people-pleasing thing that all of us, to some degree or another, will struggle with from time to time. No one's exempt from this struggle. It was Pilate's weakness. It's sometimes ours too. And if nothing else today, can we please learn from his bad example? Because why? I want to give you two reasons. One is the fear of man will cause you to not do things that you should, and being a people pleaser will cause you to do things that you shouldn't. Hear that again. The fear of man will cause you to not do things you should, and being a people pleaser will cause you to do the things you shouldn't. That's why these things are so destructive in our lives. Having the fear of man, being captive to the fear of man, or the trap of pleasing people. The one question we should all be asking is not what do people think, but it's what does God think? You know, when you're making decisions, whether it's for your company, your family, your kids, whatever the case might be, the question we should all be asking is, what does God think of this? What does God think of this? Because you and I have one audience to please and one audience to fear, and it's God Almighty. And if you endeavor to please people, we will sooner or later come up short. We cannot achieve it. There's always going to be someone that's dissatisfied with us, that doesn't like the choices that we've made, or because we're so afraid of what they will think about us, we end up making a poor choice just to try to make them happy. So listen, if you endeavor to please God and to fear God alone, guess what? He's going to take care of everything else and everybody else who doesn't like that you're a God pleaser instead of a people pleaser. And he will take care of everybody else because you fear God more than man. And this is partly our objective in life, like really, is to make sure that God is the one that we're pleasing and that God is the one that we fear. And again, to try to qualify, when I say fear, I don't mean like this recoiling fear, that God's going to punish me type of fear. I don't mean that. But what I mean is this reverential fear that God is holy, that he is righteous, that he is just, that he is pure. I want my life to be lived in such a way that honors him in private, or in public and in private. Remember that quote that Ryan shared with us last week? He said, our faith is always personal, but it's never private. Our faith needs to be known to all around us. We are called to please God, not man. To quote Oswald Chambers, he said this: the remarkable thing about God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. Whereas if you do not fear God, you fear everything else. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who also was the 6th president of Princeton, John Witherspoon, said this: it is only the fear of God that can deliver us from the fear of man. You see, there's a worldly philosophy. There's a worldly belief system and a worldly mindset, some of which is okay because it doesn't really contradict Scripture, but most of which, especially in these days, is evil. And that world system is constantly trying to wrestle you into submission. And the Bible warns us about this very thing. For example, Romans 12, verse 2 says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The Bible warns us, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits, the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. We have to always be aware of this, that there is this propensity in the world to shape us and to mold us. That shaping and molding often comes because we yield to the fear of man and the desire, the wanting to please people. And can't we all just get along? And I don't want to rock the boat, and I don't want to cause people to be upset by rocking the boat. It's like, please, rock the boat. Stop caring so much about what everybody thinks. The mob in this story, and every mob like it, is loud and annoying and relentless. And if they can't get you to join them, if they can't recruit you, then they're just simply going to wear you down until you finally do. Joshua saw this a few thousand years ago in his farewell address to the Israelites. It's in Joshua chapter 24 and verses 14 and 15. Here was his charge to them. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He made this public declaration. I don't care what everybody else does, but this is what I'm going to do. This is what my family's going to do. Like, if you don't believe in the Lord or you don't want to worship the Lord, that's your choice, but choose something. But this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to live for the Lord. So is my family. And look, I'm talking in talking about all these things, I don't mean it on just some large scale, it's us versus the evil mob of the world, that plays out obviously in life, but it plays out, this can also play out in small ways in everyday life with your family, where you work, where you go to school, with your neighbors. When we are captive to the fear of man and this trap of always trying to please people, we will inevitably violate our own conscience and sin against God. Proverbs 29, verse 25 says this: the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. Proverbs 19, verse 23 says, the fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm. And then David wrote in Psalm chapter 21, verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I be afraid? So I want to give you two final thoughts, kind of two urgings. First one is this: stop making decisions based on whom you fear or whom you want to like you. That is literally the textbook definition of being a people pleaser. But instead, start making decisions based on fearing God and pleasing him. We need to stop all of this, this trap of social media, and all this. Who likes me? Do I have many likes today? How many likes do I have? Who's following me? Do I have that little blue check mark? Likes and follows, selfie. Yeah, who cares? Right? Stop worrying about how much people like you. You have one person to please in this entire universe, and it's the Lord God Almighty. If you please him, he'll take care of everybody and everything else. He'll take care of it. In fact, Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul wrote this: for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul says you can't be both. You can't be a God pleaser and a people pleaser. So we must fear God and please him. And God will take care of everybody else. And let me close with this morning. All of this took a drastic toll on Pontius Pilate. Eusebius, the ancient historian, writes that 4 years after Pilate gave the order for Jesus to be crucified, 4 years later, Caesar Tiberius recalled Pilate to Rome, took all of his authority away, and banished him to Gaul, which is modern-day France. Eusebius then writes that around the year 39 AD, so roughly 6 or 7 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Pilate, having been so tormented with this decision that he had made and everything that had happened to him, Pilate committed suicide. Listen, it is a devastating thing to be under the bondage of the fear of man and this need to please people. We can never live up to all of the expectations that are put on us. And trying to please people will inevitably violate our own conscience and cause us to sin against God. We cannot live up to these expectations. So I just want us to pray this morning. Sort of differently, maybe not, but I want to pray some specific thoughts regarding this people-pleasing mindset. And maybe, I don't know, you've heard Pastor Darren say this a lot, when you're preparing to speak, you're speaking more to yourself than really to anybody else, often because you're hearing this on repeat as God's challenging you with these things to say and telling you what to say. And so maybe I'm the only one that needs to hear these things today, but I doubt it. And so I just want to pray this prayer together. Like, you can just listen and you can be praying it in your mind if you agree with these thoughts and if this is something you need to be praying about for yourself. But let's just pray for a minute.